This is Sensor Studio. I will update you on the situation in the Middle East war. The U.S. Institute for the Study of War analyzed that Iran seems to be aiming for a bigger strategic goal rather than simply winning the war. Iran's main strategic aim now is to gain global recognition for its control of the Strait of Hormuz, seeking authority over the strait and the ability to collect transit fees. If this happens, it could fundamentally change the global maritime order and affect other international waterways, dealing a major blow to the United States. During this war, Iran has been blocking access to the Strait of Hormuz by laying mines and launching drone and missile attacks on merchant ships. However, this kind of maritime blockade can only be maintained if accompanied by continuous attacks. In the long term, in order to control the strait, Iran would have to negotiate with the United States and gain its recognition. Only then can Iran order ships to follow its regulations and legitimately block or seize vessels that do not comply. Recently, the Iranian negotiators appear to be focusing on gaining control of the Strait of Hormuz. Analysts say this is because Iran believes that control over the Strait of Hormuz will serve as a safeguard to deter future wars with Israel and the United States. If Iran gains internationally recognized control of the Strait of Hormuz, it could block the strait as needed and disrupt global markets. Iran can also pressure Gulf countries cooperating with Israel or the US and profit significantly through a toll system. If the United States negotiates with Iran and recognizes its control over the Strait of Hormuz, these actions will gain international legitimacy. Simultaneously, Iran will be justified in cracking down on or seizing ships that violate its rules. On the other hand, if the United States, Israel, or the Gulf countries try to interfere with Iran's attempt to control the strait in a situation where the United States has already recognized Iran's rights, such actions could actually be considered acts of aggression. Because of this, how the negotiations are conducted has become extremely important. Iran is currently taking steps to bring the Strait of Hormuz completely under its own control. On May 6th, an Iranian agency known as the Persian Gulf Strait Authority sent emails to shipping companies operating vessels in the Persian Gulf. The email stated that in order for vessels to safely pass through the Strait of Hormuz, they must pay fees in Iranian rials and obtain a guarantee from an Iranian bank. This effectively forces countries and companies using the Strait of Hormuz to violate US sanctions against Iran. The email also shows that countries with vessels wanting to use the Strait of Hormuz must eventually lift sanctions on Iran. Through this war, Iran is also pursuing the easing of economic sanctions as an important strategic goal. This could serve as a foundation for Iran to rebuild its ballistic missile program even more rapidly in the future. The US oil sanctions against Iran have significantly weakened the Iranian regime's ability to generate revenue, and this is also expected to deal a considerable blow to Iran's funding for ballistic missile development. Iran is asking the United States to release roughly $100 billion in frozen assets. If released, these funds will let the Iranian regime quickly secure large sums to strategically rebuild its ballistic missile program. In particular, these funds are highly likely to be used to restore missile production factories, research and development facilities, and raw material production facilities such as steel. A significant number of these facilities have been destroyed during the ongoing war. Iran has launched ballistic missiles at US bases and allies in recent conflicts, including last year's dispute with Israel. CNN reported on May 6 that Israel is especially worried about easing economic sanctions on Iran and is strongly demanding more restrictions on Iran's ballistic missile program. In addition, easing economic sanctions could play an important role not only in military reconstruction, but also in helping the Iranian regime prevent internal collapse. Continued economic instability could spark major protests and unrest, but recovery may suppress threats to the regime's stability. However, Iran's new proactive strategic goals don't mean it has dropped its prior defensive objectives. Iran's previous objectives include limiting discussions related to its nuclear program as much as possible and preventing a situation where domestic turmoil at the level of regime overthrow occurs due to economic collapse. Regime survival is every country's main goal, and Iran's leaders have repeatedly defended their nuclear program's legitimacy. However, these mainly defensive objectives are hard to see as a clear vision for the Middle East's future order. Meanwhile, Iran appears to be forming a clearer vision for regional order. If all of Iran's strategic objectives are achieved, Iran could emerge as a very powerful country capable of bringing most Middle Eastern countries under its influence and shape their actions based on its dominance over the Hormuz region. The Iranian regime seems to be preparing for economic instability that may cause domestic unrest. This can be interpreted as a move to support Iran's existing passive strategic objective of preventing large-scale protests and the collapse of the regime as a result of a severe economic crisis. Iranian parliamentary speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf said in a May 6 voice message that the maritime blockade, economic pressure, and media warfare are enemy tactics targeting Iran's unity and trying to force its surrender. These remarks indicate the Iranian regime is bolstering its system's defense ahead of potential unrest from economic pressure. This doesn't mean they will surrender or give in right away due to economic pressure. Speaker Ghalibaf asked government officials to work to reduce the impact of economic pressure on the people and emphasized the need for wartime-level planning and so-called jihad-style management systems. He also urged the Basij militia to become fully engaged on the ground, instructing Basij members affiliated with mosques, local communities, and social organizations to actively intervene in solving residents' problems. The Basiji is an organization that the Iranian regime has used for civil defense activities, social control, and suppressing anti-government protests. Opposition-leaning media reported on April 27 that Iran's Supreme National Security Council is preparing for potential large-scale protests amid worsening economic conditions and rising social pressure. It is known that the Iranian authorities are seriously concerned about high inflation and unemployment rates, rising prices, the shutdown of the oil, petrochemical, and steel industries, and the overall economic turmoil. The fact that the Iranian leadership repeatedly emphasizes the importance of economic management in public shows that the regime itself recognizes that economic pressure can pose a serious threat to internal stability and that they are preparing control and response systems in advance to deal with this. It's hard to say the Iranian regime is preparing to surrender due to economic pressure just based on these statements and moves. It is still unclear exactly what demands the US and Iranian negotiating teams are currently discussing. A source familiar with the negotiations told a New York Post reporter that multiple proposals are circulating. Because of this, it's unclear what negotiation terms are being discussed, or if the US and Iran share the same framework. However, US government officials leaked information to Axios on May 6, and according to Axios, the White House believes it is close to signing a one-page memorandum of understanding with Iran. It is reported that the document declares an end to the war and opens a 30-day additional negotiation period for more specific agreements afterward. US sources said a final agreement hasn't been reached, but this proposal is the closest both sides have come since the conflict began. The proposed agreement reportedly requires Iran to halt uranium enrichment for 12 to 15 years. It reportedly includes partial sanction relief for Iran, release of frozen assets, and temporary easing of Strait of Hormuz restrictions. Further measures will depend on the results of follow-up negotiations in places like Islamabad or Geneva. It remains unclear exactly what restriction measures in the Strait of Hormuz this refers to. Also, it has not been confirmed whether Iranian officials have actually received the same document that the US side leaked to Axios. The Iranian government and media have mostly denied the Axios report, saying they haven't agreed to a deal or given an official response to the latest US proposal. They also said the US proposal has unacceptable terms. Some Iranian media called US media reports psychological warfare to pressure talks or manipulate the market. Instead, Iranian media reiterated the negotiation proposals previously presented by Iran and emphasized Iran's red lines. In particular, they repeatedly stated that the demand to export uranium abroad is absolutely unacceptable. In response, President Donald Trump of the United States publicly expressed a much tougher stance than the one described in Axios' report during a PBS interview on May 6th. President Trump demanded that Iran export highly enriched uranium, stop operating underground nuclear sites, and permanently end all uranium enrichment even after the sunset period, regardless of any agreement. The US maritime blockade and sanctions are currently putting significant pressure on Iran. The US Central Command announced on May 6 that since the start of the blockade operation on April 13, the US Navy has ordered a total of 52 vessels to change course or return to port. The US Central Command said a US Navy FA-18 Super Hornet disabled the steering of the Iranian-flagged oil tanker MT Hasna as it tried to breach the blockade in the Gulf of Oman. The US maritime blockade is severely pressuring Iran's crude oil storage, forcing the country to keep storing unsold oil as exports are restricted. An Iran Secretariat official told the New York Times on May 6 they started cutting crude oil production at some fields to address storage shortages. This official estimated that Iran's onshore and offshore crude oil storage facilities could reach their limits in about 40 to 45 days. The US blockade is applying military and economic pressure on Iran simultaneously. However, the current Iranian regime seems to see this pressure as a domestic stability issue to be managed internally, not as a reason to yield, and appears to be preparing a response. Hezbollah seems to be using harassment fire tactics to disrupt Israeli military operations. This is interpreted as an attempt to make it difficult for Israeli forces to fortify their positions within the newly established safe zone, while at the same time aiming to inflict continuous pressure and damage on them. Generally, harassment fire aims to restrict the enemy's movement or lower the morale of their soldiers. Hezbollah has kept up small-scale attacks on the Israeli military in southern Lebanon since the April 16 ceasefire. This process uses mortars, rockets, presumed fixed-wing drones, FPV drones, and anti-tank guided missiles. Hezbollah fighters are launching attacks from changing locations at random times each day. This seems meant to keep the Israeli army from adapting, maintain tension and psychological pressure, and slow their operations. Hezbollah has been using more FPV drones recently, which are harder to detect and counter than rockets or mortars, increasing their psychological warfare impact. An Israeli reservist in Lebanon told the Wall Street Journal on April 30th that Hezbollah is almost constantly launching FPV drones at the Israeli army, causing alarms to sound at least 10 times a day on average. This interview suggests that Hezbollah is using FPV drones not just as a simple means of attack, but as a psychological tool to instill unpredictability and constant anxiety in the Israeli army. Hezbollah is increasing psychological pressure by leaking possible suicide bomb threats to the media. Such reports can amplify the fear of suicide bombings, regardless of whether an actual attack takes place. Suicide bomb attacks are difficult to detect and can cause great psychological confusion because they make soldiers perceive anyone on the battlefield as a potential threat. A Hezbollah official told Lebanese media on May 6 that the group is considering suicide attacks in southern Lebanon. Hezbollah also frequently used these tactics in the 1980s and 1990s. In addition, a retired Lebanese general explained that even the mere possibility of such suicide attacks has a significant psychological effect by greatly increasing the anxiety of the Israeli military. In other words, even if the attack is not actually carried out, the mere possibility of it can exert considerable pressure. The constant threat of FPV drone attacks and threats of suicide attacks keeps soldiers tense, unsure of when or where attacks may occur, which can lower morale and cause severe psychological stress. In fact, it has been reported that several Israeli soldiers have been killed or injured in recent FPV drone attacks by Hezbollah. Hezbollah's supreme leader, Naim Qassem, also officially confirmed on May 4 that Hezbollah fighters are designing their attacks to maximize Israeli military casualties. Hezbollah likely wants to keep Israeli military casualties high to create political pressure and force the Israeli military to scale back or stop operations. However, it also appears they are trying not to escalate the situation to the point where a full-scale war would resume. Meanwhile, Hezbollah has stated that the purpose of their attacks is to prevent Israel from achieving its strategic objectives in southern Lebanon and to stop them from establishing what they call a foothold within Lebanon. The foothold refers to Israel expanding and securing the demilitarized zone south of Lebanon's Litani River. Currently, Hezbollah is mainly targeting Israeli forces along 4 main axes in southern Lebanon. This includes the Taibi Kantera axis in the southeast, Nakura in the southwest, Koza in the south-central area, and Bint Jbeil. These are key military strongholds for Israeli forces. These are vital logistical routes for supplying and moving ground forces in southern Lebanon. Only by securing these routes can Israeli forces move troops and expand operations freely. However, it appears that for now, Hezbollah has not been able to steer Israel into losing its will to continue the war as they desire. Israeli forces are under criticism and political pressure as casualties rise from ongoing Hezbollah attacks. However, the U.S. Institute for the Study of War found Hezbollah's attacks haven't significantly influenced Israel's strategic decisions or prompted a review of its operations in Lebanon. On the contrary, Israeli Chief of Staff Eyal Zamir has reportedly ordered the Israeli forces to strike Hezbollah's FPV drone production facilities and supply networks in areas beyond southern Lebanon. The Israeli military argues it must expand its operations in southern Lebanon to address these threats. And Chief of Staff Zamir once again made it clear on May 6 that the Israeli military will continue its operations against Hezbollah. On May 6, the Israeli military launched an airstrike in Beirut's southern suburb, targeting a Hezbollah Radwan unit commander. It was the first Israeli strike on Beirut since the temporary ceasefire began. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Israel Katz jointly announced that on May 6, the Israeli military carried out an airstrike in Beirut, targeting Hezbollah Radwan unit commander Malik Balaut. A source close to Hezbollah told AFP that Malik Balaut was killed in the airstrike. It is still unconfirmed if other senior Hezbollah officials, such as the Radwan unit's deputy commander, were present during the attack. Israeli sources said on May 6 that Israel had informed the United States in advance of the airstrike. Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Katz stated that Hezbollah's Radwan unit, led by Balaut, launched projectiles at Israel and injured Israeli soldiers. The Radwan unit is Hezbollah's elite special operations force, created to launch large-scale ground attacks into Israeli territory with Iranian support. Israel last struck a Hezbollah stronghold in Beirut's southern suburbs on April 8, before the temporary ceasefire began on April 16. Akram al-Tahabi, leader of the Iranian-backed Iraqi militia Harakat Hezbollah al-Nujaba, rejected calls to disarm on May 6, insisting their weapons are a non-negotiable red line. Harakat Hezbollah al-Nujaba is considered one of the Iraqi militias that has been among the most active in carrying out armed attacks during the ongoing conflict and the war that began on October 7. They have mostly taken part in various attacks under the name Islamic Resistance in Iraq. As these militia attacks continue, the United States is increasing pressure on the Iraqi government to disarm the Iran-backed militias and to dismantle the PMF, a coalition of pro-Iranian militias. The PMF is formally part of Iraq's national security, but in reality, it includes many pro-Iranian militias like Harakat Hezbollah al-Nujaba. It is known that many of these groups are more strongly influenced by and subordinate to Iran's directives than to the Iraqi government. On May 5th, the US State Department offered up to $10 million for information on Akram al-Tahabi. His latest statement came after Iraqi media reports on May 5th, the previous day. Brigadier General Esmail Ghani, commander of Iran's Quds Force, is reportedly urging some pro-Iranian Iraqi groups to scale back militia activities and focus more on politics. Harakat Hezbollah al-Nujaba is also among these groups. Commander Ghani's plan appears to aim at steering Iraqi militias toward reducing armed attacks and instead expanding their political influence. This also aims to prevent the United States from increasing financial sanctions or economic pressure on Iraq. If US pressure increases, it could have negative effects not only on the Iraqi economy but also on the Iranian regime. This strategy is seen as reducing armed actions while strengthening pro-Iranian political influence in Iraq's government. I'll upload a video if more news comes in. This concludes the video. Thank you.